What's up guys, my name's Liam, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the Matrova mouse pads. These have specifically caught my interest due to the fact that they have so many different surfaces and base options, and they even allow you to customize your mouse pad, pick any one of their surfaces with any one of their available bases, and even adjust it to the size of your liking. So in this video I'm going to do my best to try and break down how my experience has been with all of them, and hopefully I'll be able to help you decide, if you're interested in looking at these, which one of these could possibly be the perfect option for you. So let's check it out. And before we get started today, I did want to let you know that these were sent out to me. However, everything you're going to be hearing in this video is going to be my own words and my own opinions. If you are interested in picking up any of these mouse pads, you can do so in a couple of different ways. You can come in here and take a look at each one of the surfaces and click on them. They do have them pre-assembled with the base of their choice that they feel like is paired best with the selected surface. And you do have two different size options if you want to just pick these up as they come. And with this option, sometimes it will allow you to choose another base. And if you do not wish to use any one of these pre-configured options, you can come in here to this custom option, and inside of here you can individually choose each piece of the build of this mouse pad. So you can choose between all of their available surfaces. They also allow you to choose between each one of their bases. Then you can also come down here and pick whatever size you would like your mouse pad to come in that works out best for you, and they even give you an option to print your own image on top of all of these surfaces. Please do keep in mind as you are watching this video today that all of the surfaces that I did receive, they do not have any type of printing on them. I've dealt with many mouse pads in the past, and just about every instance that I can think of, when you do actually print on top of the surface, it can change the properties. So I do apologize that I didn't get a chance to pick up any of these surfaces yet with printing on them. Hopefully that's something that I'll be able to cover later on in a future video if possible. And though they do plan on offering more bases down the line in the future, I currently have 4 different versions of their bases. When you do pick them up, they do come with their logo down here in the bottom right hand corner. When you do use the custom option, you can either put the logo on there or choose to leave it off if you wish to do so. The stitching all the way edge to edge on all of these pads was done very well, and just kind of typical with any type of mouse pad out there. When you do have a softer base, the surface does sit up a bit higher over the stitching, as opposed to the firmer that the base starts to get, the stitching starts to become more at level with the surface. In some cases it still can sit slightly below, but again with the firmer bases it will probably be about at level with the surface itself. We'll start with the softest base, which is the Pour-On-like rubber base. This is X-Soft, and it does sit at 4 millimeters in thickness. Being an X-Soft base, it's pretty self-explanatory. This is the softest of all of them and the most plush and easy to push into. When comparing this to something like a Pour-On X-Soft, I do feel like this still does actually have a really quick rebound. And even though I'm not generally a fan of X-Soft style bases, this one honestly hasn't been really bothering me too much, and I have enjoyed using it with the quicker rebound elastic properties. It hasn't felt too muddy for me, at least with these surfaces that I've been testing it out on. Next up, I also have the Star Flash base. This one is also at 4 millimeters in thickness. This is rated at a soft, and this is a little bit more firm than the X-Soft version. I would say this does feel even a little bit more firm than just a regular Pour-On soft style of a base. Then next up, I have 2 different versions of the polyurethane base. I do have the soft version and the mid version. When taking a look at just the aesthetic of both of these bases, it does look very similar to the Alpha-Cell bases. I did confirm with them that this is polyurethane. It is not Alpha-Cell. Even if you were to go with a soft version of this base, I still feel like it feels very firm, and it feels closer to a mid-style base. However, with that being said, the mid version is still firmer than the soft base, and as I was going back and forth and comparing this to an Artisan mid, I feel like the Artisan feels just slightly a little bit more firm than the mid version of this. And I do know they're going to be coming out with firmer options in the future, but if you do like the Artisan style mid base, I would recommend going with the mid. And like I said, the soft, it still feels closer to mid, but if you would like a little bit more plushness where you can push into the pad, that is where I'd recommend the soft version. And the last thing I will say about these bases for now is they've all have been sticking to my desk really nicely. Even the mid versions have been very sticky. I would say probably the Star Flash version has been the least sticky on my desk compared to all of them, whereas the Pour-On-like rubber base has been the most sticky. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump into the surfaces. I'm actually going to start with the slowest pad first, which is the Shadow Hunt, and I'm going to make my way up. This is the most controlled surface that they currently do offer. When I first through this on my desk, and even just the touch of it, it did remind me a lot of something like the Lethal Gaming Gear Jupiter Pro. Though it might not exactly be a one-to-one, this actually does have a really smooth feeling surface. If you rub your finger along the X-axis, you do notice a little bit of a texture there, and I feel like a little bit less here along the Y-axis. But the properties of this pad is it actually is very controlled. So the one thing I will say about this pad is you don't get a whole lot of a loose glide there. As you can see, it stops pretty rapidly. The one thing that I do feel about this is, even though it does have a really high sense of static friction, I don't feel like it is too muddy to where I feel like I'm fighting too much with it tugging back and forth as I'm making the micro corrections. Again, the entire time that you're moving it around, you can just stop pretty much on a dime, but I never really found myself fighting with this pad or feel like I was getting stuck as I was trying to adjust my shots. And the same thing on the dynamic glide, as I feel like both the static and the dynamic friction are very evenly matched on this pad. As I was going back and forth and A/B testing them, comparing them to one another, they do feel pretty similar. However, I would say that this Shadow Hunt does noticeably feel a bit quicker than the Jupiter Pro, where it does have a little bit less of a static and dynamic friction. So I'll go ahead and I will drop the glide test comparison between both of them. So next up, another control option that we have is the Rascal, and clearly this is quicker than the Shadow Hunt. I will go ahead and throw down a glide comparison between both of them, but when touching the surface on this, I do feel like there's a little bit more of a texture here along the Y-axis, but again, I do feel like the surface is still pretty smooth. This pad to me is still a really well-controlled option, and just as I was going back and forth and trying to think of where it falls in terms of performance, I wouldn't say that it is exactly the same thing of something like the Artisan Type 99, but there are still, however, some similarities there. Just the dynamic glide kind of reminded me of the Artisan Type 99 a bit. However, when I was going back and forth and A/B testing them, the one thing I felt like is on the Type 99, I feel like it has a higher sense of static friction. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I didn't really like it. I felt like the Type 99, just for my personal opinion, was that the dynamic was a bit quicker than the static, whereas this one, I feel like it's a little bit more neutral. So even though this does have some tugging there as you're going back and forth, and you do notice a bit of static friction with some really decent stopping properties, again, it is pretty close to just the overall feeling and speed that you're going to be getting along the dynamic friction. So I'll go and show you guys a really quick close-up shot of the surfaces of this and the Type 99, and then I will go ahead and I will drop a glide test comparison between both of them. So next up we have the Scarlet, and out of all of these mouse pads, this is quite possibly my favorite one, but the performance on the surface, I would say this and the Rascal aren't really a whole lot further apart from one another. In fact, as I was doing my glide test, I feel like the dynamic friction is almost pretty similar between both of them, where in my opinion, when you're actually using the Scarlet, this one does feel just a little bit quicker than that. But the one thing I do notice about this is there is a little bit less of the static friction there. So even though I would still categorize this probably as more of a control pad, you could probably put it somewhere in a balanced section, more on the controlled end. But with this one, you're just going to get a little bit more of a smoother, quicker glide, where it is easier to make the micro corrections, but you still get a pretty decent sense of control as you're using this. And as I was going back and forth and comparing the Scarlet to everything else out there, just the most similar pad that I could think of that this felt most familiar to is something like the Zowie GSR3. So I will go ahead and show you guys a close-up of what both those surfaces look like next to one another, and then I will also go ahead and I will drop the glide test comparison between both of them. So as you can see, I have both copies of the pad here. This bottom version has the pour-on-like rubber base, and this top one here does have this Star Flash base. So realistically, when I got these and I was just testing them out and messing around, I really did like the properties of the Star Flash base, and I almost kind of felt like it was my preferred base. But as I was going back and forth and just really putting a lot of testing on both versions of these pads, the one thing that I did find out is at the end of the day, I actually ended up preferring the performance of this pour-on-like rubber base just matched, I feel like, a little bit better with this surface and what I generally prefer in a pad. There is a difference in the properties between both of these in the way that they perform. Now, when doing a glide test, the dynamic glide on both of these pads is going to be identical since it is the same surface. The one difference that I did notice, however, is with this Star Flash base. I don't know why it is, but for whatever reason, this pad is like stretchier and it makes the surface softer. So when I was using this with the Star Flash base, the one thing I noticed is I felt like it added a little bit more of static friction, so there was a little bit more tugging going back and forth. And then coming over here, even though this is an X-Soft base with this Poron-like rubber, for whatever reason, the surface on it is stiffer. As you can see here, when I go to stretch it, it just makes the surface feel a little bit tighter, where this one, it just makes it feel quite a bit more loose. So the fact that this does have a little bit more of a tighter feeling surface makes this pad feel a little bit quicker, and you get a little bit smoother on the micro adjustments with the static friction. And with the GSR3 being one of my favorite pads out there, that does have a bit of a firmer base with the SCR style base, and I do feel like it does make the surface on the GSR3 feel just a little bit more consistent and kind of along the lines of, like I said, what I prefer. So that's probably why I did prefer just the properties of this Poron-like rubber base. However, if you're somebody on the opposite end of the spectrum where you do like to have a little bit more static friction, a little bit more tugging and stopping power, then that's where I would recommend going with this Star Flash base. All right, next up we have the Balance X. And just touching this pad, you do notice a little bit more texture there than some of the other previous pads where the surface felt a little bit more soft. And in all honesty, they do compare this on the website to the Artisan Zero, and truly the feeling of it does feel very similar to that. And when it comes to the performance, the name really does do it justice, because I feel like this really does find a sweet spot of a balanced mouse pad. Compared to the previous options, you're going to get a little bit of a quicker dynamic and even a little bit of a quicker static friction, where you can still get a pretty decent sense of control there, but it is pretty effortless to make your micro adjustments. As I was going back and forth and comparing this to the Artisan Zero, I'll go ahead and do a really close-up shot where you can see the weave on them looks really similar to one another. The one thing that I found, however, is my Artisan Zero did feel quite a bit quicker than this pad, and I kind of feel like just in general, the overall speed with the properties of the dynamic and the static friction on this did kind of fall more in line with something like the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn Pro. So I would say that overall, the feeling of this pad, even though to the touch feels closer to a Zero, the performance from my experience kind of falls in line, and this is something that performs more similarly to something like the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn Pro. So if you've used the Zero in the past and have liked it, but wanted just a little bit more control, then this would be a solid option for you to check out. All right, so next up we have the Violet Mist. I would go ahead and categorize this pad as a balance more on the speed end of the spectrum. So this is when we start getting into the speed pads. With this one, it does have a bit more of texture. This is one of the higher textured pads. And in their website, they've done a fantastic job where they actually compare this to the Hayate Atsu. And it truly, I think that that is the perfect example. This does have a pretty quick dynamic glide speed overall, but when comparing this to the Hayate Atsu, I kind of felt like this version felt a little bit more controlled when you're down here in the static friction. Though you don't get a whole lot of tugging back and forth, you're able to make micro corrections pretty effortlessly. The more that you push into it, you are still able to get a pretty decent sense of control there for the speed that this pad does offer overall. So I'll go ahead and show you guys a really quick close-up shot of this next to the Hayate Atsu, and then I will go ahead and I will drop a glide test comparison. And one last thing to mention is that this pad actually did come with that polyurethane soft base. So again, this does feel actually pretty firm, close to mid base, but it is more plush and a lot easier to push into than a mid style base. All right, next up we have the Pink Storm, and I would say that the previous pad and the Pink Storm, this does also have a textured surface. So these are probably two of the most textured surfaces out of all their mouse pads that they do offer. However, this pad, even though the surface does still feel like a cloth surface, the dynamic glide on this is actually pretty quick. Now, even though I do classify this as a speed pad, and it does have a pretty quick dynamic glide, as you can clearly see there, it doesn't feel like any one of the slippery types of surfaces of speed pads out there that still has that cloth style surface. And with the texture on it, you do still notice quite a bit of static friction there if you were to push really hard in the pad. Now, if you're just being light with it, the static friction is still pretty effortlessly. You don't really notice a whole lot of tugging there. But again, the more that you start to press into it, you can really get more of a solid sense of stopping power. So though I wouldn't say it's a direct clone or comparison, the feeling of this feels somewhat similar to something like the Neptune Pro, where again, it's a fast surface, but again, you got a little bit of that texture there to gain some control where it has that cloth style feeling. But just with the overall general speed of how quick the dynamic friction is on this is pretty much the same speed on the dynamic to me as the Breeze is, having a little bit more control down in the static friction. But I would say that the dynamic kind of falls in line with something like the Lamzu Energon. I'll show you guys a quick close-up of both of these pads next to each other. Again, do keep in mind that the Energon does have lower static friction and does feel quite a bit more slippery in this one, where you do get a greater degree of control. But I will go ahead and also drop a glide test comparison between both of those. All right, and then finally we got the Breeze. Like I also mentioned, this does have that polyurethane mid base that it did come with, and I would say that this surface out of all of them is possibly tied for first, if not maybe my second favorite. But I have been really enjoying the properties of this. Where the last two pads did have a pretty high texture on the surface, this one actually feels very smooth. So kind of smoother in terms of the touch of something like the Lamzu Energon. Though they aren't exactly like one another, like I did mention, the dynamic glide is really close to the Pink Storm on this. I do feel like this one does have a little bit less of static friction, so you get a little bit of a quicker glide going back and forth, but the dynamic on them is really not that far apart from one another. As I was going back and forth and comparing this to something like the Lamzu Energon, the one thing that I did clearly notice is even though that the dynamic glide between both of them is pretty close to one another, this one does have a higher sense of static friction. So I do feel like you are able to gather a greater sense of control or stopping power when using this surface. So even though this is a speed pad, I wouldn't say that it feels as quick or slippery as something even like the Artisan Raiden. As I was testing both of them next to each other, again, I felt like this one got a greater sense of control, whereas the Raiden just felt quite a bit more slippery and a little bit faster to me when you're actually using it in game. All right, guys, so that wraps things up on these Matrova mouse pads. And like I said, I'm actually a really big fan of what they're doing here. And I think that their website is really cool and unique. The fact that you can go in and build the pads based on what you think is going to work out best for you is a really cool option that you're able to customize it exactly to your needs. And so far, my experience with just the build quality of these and the usability of them in general has felt really solid. Like I mentioned earlier, probably my favorite pads, I'd go with the Scarlet. I really do like this Breeze a lot, depending on if you're looking for speed or a little bit more control. And I even really like the properties of the Balance X pad as well. And I honestly do think that all of them are great. Those are just my three favorites based off of my preference, though you should always go with what you know works best, or have an at least general idea on what will work best for you. But since I've been so clearly enjoying these, like I said, perhaps I'll do some more reviews on these pads in the future, see if I can get kind of some different versions to kind of try and break them down for you, even getting a printed surface. I do know that they're working on other types of bases and even other types of pads down the line in the future. And my experience with what they've sent out to me, I've honestly really been enjoying them a lot. So if they are something that you're interested in checking out, I could definitely recommend that you do so. So if you guys have any additional questions or feel like I left anything out, please let me know in the comments down below. If you have enjoyed watching this video and are interested in seeing more videos like this in the future, please drop this video a like and subscribe to my channel. And thank you guys so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.